Let's learn how to cut and strip a wire. Why do we need wire? Well, we will be building circuits inside of one of these. This is a breadboard. We're going to talk about this in depth soon, but we need to make contact with the wire that's inside of the breadboard to make contact to things like chips and LEDs and resistors and other wire. Now, if you've done any electronics before, you might be familiar with lots of different kinds of wire. So one thing you could buy is this box of pre-cut and pre-stripped and pre-bent wires. Now, I don't like to give this kind of thing out because each wire comes in a specific length per color, and we're going to want to color code our wires, and that means that sometimes it'll be a long wire, sometimes it'll be a short wire for a specific color, and with this kind of pre-made kit you can't really do that, so we're not going to use this. Maybe you've also seen this kind of wire. This is usually called a ribbon cable, and the ribbon cable has been given individual ends that you can peel off from the stack. Now you have a really nice wire because this is very flexible, but it has a nice hard tip that fits well into the breadboard. But what's wrong with this? Because, well, they come in a lot of different colors, so you can color code all your wires. But if you're trying to connect two rows together, like that row to that row, we have a very long, dangly wire hanging out of our breadboard. This is kind of messy, and some of the circuits we will build will have dozens of wires, and that will, you'll put this in your bag, and this will get ripped out. So those, we're not going to use these either. And then sometimes you get even smaller ones that you can buy in kits. These are, great in a pinch, but not ideal because we can't make them the right length and the right color. So in your lab kit is a bundle of wire. This is just regular, what they call bell wire or solid core wire from McMaster. It's 24-26 gauge, which means the thickness of the wire that's inside of the insulation, the larger the number of the gauge, the thinner the wire. And it's solid core, meaning that there's one piece of wire inside. So if I take this wire and I bend it, it'll stay bent, like a paper clip. These pre-made wires, one of the reasons why they're so nice is that they're not solid wire inside. They're stranded. So when I bend it, it bounces back. Let's take a look at what's inside. So I'm going to take my wire strippers and just cut this guy in half and yank out some insulation. And yeah, I can see inside of this wire are maybe 7 or 12 individual wires. So stranded wire like this is really great because it makes a very flexible wire, and if you were to bend it back and forth a bunch of times, maybe 1 or 2 of those would eventually break because of the intense amount of fatigue. But when you have this kind of bare wire, it doesn't really fit in the breadboard very well. You have to take those strands and twist them together, try to shove them in the hole, but they just fray, and so stranded wire doesn't play well with a breadboard. There is definitely plenty of uses for stranded wire, but in a lab class like this, we won't ever use it. That's, of course, why they solder their stranded wire onto a solid piece of wire at the end. But sometimes they're not soldered, sometimes they're crimped, and that means there could be a break in between here and here. Very difficult to debug. So another reason why we're not going to use those. So let's take a random piece of our wire, take some purple, and cut like 2 inches. And maybe we should talk about this instrument I'm using. This is a pair of wire cutter and strippers, and also has some pliers action to it. This is particularly from Pololu, but there are lots of vendors for this kind of small gauge wire. Most wires, of course, are much thicker than the wire we'll be using in class, used by like electricians in your house. So this isn't really the kind of tool that they would have. This is much smaller. But the first thing you need to know is how do you open it. So usually you give it a little squeeze, and then you unlock the thumb lock. And depending on the model you have, sometimes it's named lock, and sometimes it's a little more confusing. But usually you have to give it a little squeeze, undo some kind of lock, and now it can open and close. And if it's the first time you're using it, I like to prime it a little because it's never been used before. So wake it up. Okay. And then by the center pivot point is the cutting area. And then we've got like an alligator tooth part. And then at the tip we have some pliers. So I don't know, I never really use the pliers very much. We'll be using the cutters and usually one specific hole from the alligators because all of our wires are the same gauge. So these are usually pretty soft steel. Only use the cutting part to cut your insulated wire. don't try to cut a bolt. Don't try to cut anything in metal that is not soft metal like this copper or aluminum alloy wire, because even these ones, which I've used probably for a year now, are all kind of dinged up, and I've only ever cut wire. So you'll mangle these pretty quick if you try to cut something that's not wire. So I used it to cut this piece of wire, and I would like to be able to use this wire to plug into my breadboard. So how much insulation do I need to remove? Well, the breadboard's roughly 7 millimeters deep, so I want to remove maybe like 5 millimeters of the insulation from this wire, so that we'll plug into one of these holes without leaving any exposed wire, because a piece of exposed wire might touch something else. And just as bad, if I only remove like 2 millimeters of the insulation from this wire, it may look like it's in the hole, but it's not going to be touching the piece of metal in the breadboard. So I need to remove, a good ½ centimeter of insulation from this wire. So how do we do that? You'll notice on one side of the alligator teeth it says AWG, that's the gauge of the wire, and this pair starts at 20 and goes up to 30. And I think this is 24 or 26 gauge wire, so that means I should be using the 24 or the 26 hole. So what happens if I use the wrong hole? Let's try the 20 hole. I'll stick it in the hole that says 20, and I'll squeeze down so that I should be cutting the insulation. And when I pull to try to remove the wire and strip off the insulation, I can't get it out. And that's because I've started to cut the insulation on this wire, but I haven't cut all the way through down to the metal, so I'd have to pull really hard to get it off. So 20 is, the hole is too big. So if I go to what I think it is, like 24, and cut down, it's now cut into the insulation, and I pull, and if I pull hard enough, the insulation falls off, and I've got bare exposed wire, and that looks like just the right amount to fit into my breadboard, so that there's no exposed wire when I'm plugged into the hole. It's tempting to use a hole that is too small, so let me try the 28 size hole. I will cut down on the insulation, and now when I pull on the wire, it's stuck again. Why is that? It's because it's cut all the way through the insulation, and now it's cutting into the wire. So now when I pull it, I can't because the wire's stuck there. So if I let go of my grip a little, in fact, I just now take the insulation off, because I definitely cut all the way through the insulation. That's now a stripped wire. That's too much exposed wire, but just for example, I could plug that in. The danger, though, is that when I cut the insulation, I also nicked the wire there. And just like a small piece of metal, like a paper clip that has a nick, if I bend it back and forth a few times, it'll break right at that nick. And where is the nick? Right where the insulation was cut, which means that if this had been in my board and it broke, I would have a piece of wire stuck perfectly flush inside of that hole, and I'd need some tweezers to be able to get back out again. So we don't use a hole that's too small to remove the insulation. And your wire might be slightly bigger or slightly smaller, and your wire strippers might be ground a little more or less with more or less precision. So everybody's will be a little different. So for you, find the right size hole. Sometimes 26 is the right one. 26 on mine comes off very easily, so it might be nicking the wire just a little. 24, I pull, and eventually it comes off, so that's definitely not cutting the wire. 22, I can't get anything out. Let's go to 30. 30 makes a good wire cutter. I just cut it right in half. Okay, so do this a bunch of times. Get some practice. Cut your piece of wire, maybe 2 inches long. Remove about 5 millimeters of insulation from either end. Practice sticking it into your breadboard. Now ideally, your wires don't look like this. They should be nice and flush against the board. Any loopy wire like this will easily get popped out when it goes in your bag. And then we try to color code our wires. Typically black wire is used for ground, red or green wire is used for positive and negative 5 volts, and then all the other colors that you have can be used for any other signal. Using that color convention helps with debugging, because you might build a circuit, come back to it a week later, not remember what all the wires do, but if they're color coded, you have a good indication of what's power, ground, and signal.